Chapter 16 of Outwitting the Hun, My Escape from a German Prison Camp by Pat O'Brien. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, I Approach the Frontier. To get out of the city, it would be necessary to pass 2 guards. This I had learned in the course of my walks at night, having frequently traveled to the city limits with the idea of finding out just what conditions I would have to meet when the time came for me to leave. A German soldier's uniform, however, no longer worried me as it had at first. I had mingled with the Huns so much in the city that I began to feel that I was really a Belgian, and I assumed the indifference that the latter seemed to feel. I decided, therefore, to walk out of the city in the daytime when the sentries would be less apt to be on the watch. It worked splendidly. I was not held up a moment, the sentries evidently taking me for a Belgian peasant on his way to work. Traveling faster than I had ever done before since my escape, I was soon out in the open country, and the first Belgian I came to, I approached for food. He gave me half his lunch, and we sat down on the side of the road to eat it. Of course, he tried to talk to me, but I used the old ruse of pretending I was deaf and dumb, and he was quite convinced that it was so. He made various efforts to talk to me in pantomime, but I could not make out what he was getting at, and I think he must have concluded that I was not only half-starved, deaf and dumb, but loony into the bargain. When night came, I looked around for a place to rest. I had decided to travel in the daytime as well as at night, because I understood that I was only a few miles from the frontier, and I was naturally anxious to get there at the earliest possible moment, although I realized that there I would encounter the most hazardous part of my whole adventure. To get through that heavily guarded, barbed, and electrically charged barrier was a problem that I hated to think of even, although the hours I spent endeavoring to devise some way of outwitting the Huns were many. It had occurred to me, for instance, that it would not be such a difficult matter to vault over the electric fence, which was only 9 feet high. In college, I know, a 10-foot vault is considered a high school boy's accomplishment, but there were 2 great difficulties in the way of the solution. In the first place, it would be no easy matter to get a pole of the right length, weight, and strength to serve the purpose. More particularly, however, the pole vault idea seemed to be out of the question because of the fact that on either side of the electric fence, 6 feet from it, was a 6-foot barbed wire barrier. To vault safely over a 9-foot electrically charged fence was one thing, but to combine with it a 12-foot broad vault was a feat which even a college athlete in the pink of condition would be apt to flunk. Indeed, I don't believe it is possible. Another plan that seemed halfway reasonable was to build a pair of stilts about 12 or 14 feet high and walk over the barriers one by one. As a youngster I had acquired considerable skill in stilt walking, and I have no doubt that with the proper equipment it would have been quite feasible to have walked out of Belgium as easily as possible in that way, but whether or not I was going to have a chance to construct the necessary stilts remained to be seen. There were a good many bicycles in use by the German soldiers in Belgium, and it had often occurred to me that if I could have stolen one, the tires would have made excellent gloves and insulated coverings for my feet in case it was necessary for me to attempt to climb over the electric fence bodily. But as I had never been able to steal a bicycle, this avenue of escape was closed to me. I decided to wait until I arrived at the barrier and then make up my mind how to proceed. To find a decent place to sleep that night, I crawled under a barbed wire fence, thinking it led into some field. As I passed under, one of the barbs caught in my coat, and in trying to pull myself free, I shook the fence for several yards. Instantly there came out of the night the nerve-racking command, "Halt!" Again I feared I was done for. I crouched close down on the ground in the darkness, not knowing whether to take to my legs and trust to the Hun's missing me in the darkness if he fired, or stay right where I was. It was foggy as well as dark, and although I knew the sentry was only a few feet away from me, I decided to stand, or rather lie, still. I think my heart made almost as much noise as the rattling of the wire in the first place, but it was a tense few moments for me. I heard the German say a few words to himself, but didn't understand them, of course, and then he made a sound as if to call a dog, and I realized that his theory of the noise he had heard was that a dog had made its way through the fence. For perhaps 5 minutes I didn't stir, and then, figuring that the German had probably continued on his beat, I crept quietly under the wire again, this time being mighty careful to hug the ground so close that I wouldn't touch the wire, and made off in a different direction. Evidently the barbed wire fence had been thrown around an ammunition depot or something of the kind, and it was not a field at all that I had tried to get into. I figured that other sentries were probably in the neighborhood, and I proceeded very gingerly. After I got about a mile away from this spot, I came to a humble Belgian house, and I knocked at the door and applied for food in my usual way, pointing to my mouth to indicate I was hungry, and to my ears and mouth to imply that I was deaf and dumb. The Belgian woman who lived in the house brought me a piece of bread and 2 cold potatoes, and as I sat there eating them she eyed me very keenly. I haven't the slightest doubt that she realized I was a fugitive. She lived so near the border that it was more than likely that other fugitives had come to her before, and for that reason I appreciated more fully the extent of the risk she ran, for no doubt the Germans were constantly watching the conduct of these Belgians who lived near the line. My theory that she realized that I was not a Belgian at all, but probably some English fugitive, was confirmed a moment later when, as I made ready to go, she touched me on the arm and indicated that I was to wait a moment. She went to a bureau and brought out 2 pieces of fancy Belgian lace, which she insisted upon my taking away, although at that particular moment I had as much use for Belgian lace as an elephant has for a safety razor, but I was touched with her thoughtfulness and pressed her hand to show my gratitude. She would not accept the money I offered her. I carried that lace through my subsequent experiences, feeling that it would be a fine souvenir for my mother, although, as a matter of fact, if she had known that it was going to delay my final escape for even a single moment, as it did, I am quite sure she would rather I had never seen it. On one piece of lace was the Flemish word "Charité," and on the other the word "Esperanza." At the time I took these words to mean charity and experience, and all I hoped was that I would get as much of the one as I was getting of the other before I finally got through. I learned subsequently that what the words really stood for was charity and hope, and then I was sure that my kind Belgian friend had indeed realized my plight, and that her thoughtful souvenir was intended to encourage me in the trials she must have known were before me. I didn't let the old Belgian lady know, because I did not want to alarm her unnecessarily, but that night I slept in her back yard, leaving early in the morning before it became light. Later in the day I applied at another house for food. It was occupied by a father and mother and 10 children. I hesitated to ask them for food without offering to pay for it, as I realized what a task it must have been for them to support themselves without having to feed a hungry man. Accordingly, I gave the man a mark and then indicated that I wanted something to eat. They were just about to eat themselves, apparently, and they let me partake of their meal, which consisted of a huge bowl of some kind of soup, which I was unable to identify, and which they served in ordinary wash basins. I don't know that they ever used the basins to wash in as well, but whether they did or not did not worry me very much. The soup was good, and I enjoyed it very much. All the time I was there I could see the father and the eldest son, a boy about 17, were extremely nervous. I had indicated to them that I was deaf and dumb, but if they believed me it didn't seem to make them any more comfortable. I lingered at the house for about an hour after the meal, and during that time a young man came to call on the eldest daughter, a young woman of perhaps 18. The caller eyed me very suspiciously, although I must have resembled anything but a British officer. They spoke in Flemish, and I did not understand a word they said, but I think they were discussing my probable identity. During their conversation I had a chance to look around the rooms. There were 3 altogether, 2 fairly large and one somewhat smaller, about 14 feet long and 6 deep. In this smaller room there were 2 double-decked beds, which were apparently intended to house the whole family, although how the whole 12 of them could sleep in that one room will ever remain a mystery to me. From the kitchen you could walk directly into the cow barn, where 2 cows were kept, and this, as I have pointed out before, is the usual construction of the poorer Belgian houses. I could not make out why the caller seemed to be so antagonistic to me, and yet I am sure he was arguing with the family against me. Perhaps the fact that I wasn't wearing wooden shoes I doubt whether I could have obtained a pair big enough for me had convinced him that I was not really a Belgian, because there was nothing about me otherwise which could have given him that idea. At that time, and I suppose it is true to day, about 90% of the people in Belgium were wearing wooden shoes. Among the peasants I don't believe I ever saw any other kind of footwear, and they are more common there than they are in Holland. The Dutch wear them more as a matter of custom. In Belgium they are a dire necessity because of the lack of leather. I was told that during the coming year practically all the peasants and poorer people in Germany, too, will adopt wooden shoes for farm work, as that is one direction in which wood can be substituted for leather without much loss. When the young man left, I left shortly afterward, as I was not at all comfortable about what his intentions were regarding me. For all I knew, he might have gone to notify the German authorities that there was a strange man in the vicinity, more perhaps to protect his friends from suspicion of having aided me than to injure me. At any rate, I was not going to take any chances, and I got out of that neighborhood as rapidly as I could. That night found me right on the frontier of Holland. Chapter 17